Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 13, The Empire Strikes Back. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, when Emperor Anastasius died without a clear successor, Justin, the commander of the palace guard, gained enough support from the influential racing factions to become emperor. While he had been a compromise candidate, Justin was able to ensure the smooth succession of his nephew, Justinian. Although he became emperor roughly a year after Theodoric died, Justinian soon became preoccupied with the Persian War and riots in the capital. The war was quickly resolved, but the riots proved to be genuinely dangerous. Tired of the racing factions interfering in politics, Justinian had cracked down on the hooligans, which had provoked a major riot. It appeared that Justinian might be forced to abdicate, but loyal troops had arrived in the capital and massacred the rioters while they were gathered in the hippodrome. The riots were used as an excuse to eliminate any rivals for the throne, leaving Justinian in firm control of the Eastern Roman Empire. So, what would Justinian do next? While he was undoubtedly tempted by the chaos in the West following Theodoric's death, he needed an opportunity. Actually, Justinian already had an opportunity. Since Hilderic, king of the Vandals, had been overthrown by his cousin Gelimer in May 530. Oddly enough, Hilderic had stayed true to his mother's faith and ended the persecution of Catholic Christians, first started by his father Huneric 40 years earlier. This religious toleration was part of a policy designed to improve relations with Constantinople. However, military defeats during Hilderic's campaign against Berber raiders had given Gelimer the opportunity to launch a coup. The coup against an ally gave Justinian an excuse to interfere in North Africa, but he was still busy with his war against Persia at the time. Instead, he had to content himself with sending envoys to deliver stern letters to Gelimer. However, 2 years later, Gelimer was struggling to deal with two separate revolts, which encouraged Justinian to send an invasion fleet in the summer of 533. The army would be commanded by Belisarius, who had risen to fame by leading the troops that had slaughtered the rioters in the hippodrome. Belisarius had good luck since Gelimer had sent the Vandal fleet to crush a revolt on Sardinia, enabling the imperial fleet to safely land the army. If the Vandal fleet had been waiting, it is likely that Belisarius would have called off the invasion rather than risk a sea battle. Aware that his army would be viewed as invaders, Belisarius executed looters and constantly proclaimed that he was there to restore Hilderic to the throne. Gelimer was vulnerable since much of his army was away crushing the revolt on Sardinia and the rest was spread out. Still, Gelimer was determined to defend his kingdom, so he gathered as many men as he could. It did not matter. Roughly a week after landing, Belisarius had captured Carthage. It is important to point out that the army led by Belisarius was completely different from the traditional infantry legions that had conquered the lands that became the Roman Empire. Wars against the Persians and the Huns had taught military commanders the need for an army that integrated infantry and cavalry. Instead of massive legions of infantry with small groups of cavalry hired from allied barbarians for scouting, the new model army of the Eastern Roman Empire was composed largely of cavalry. The light cavalry of archers on horseback would disrupt the enemy in order to leave them vulnerable to charges by more heavily armored cavalry with lances that was supported by infantry that could move quickly to support the cavalry. The infantry units now included more archers to protect them against horse archers. Sadly, there are no surviving military manuals, probably because none were written, but the evolution in military tactics definitely took place gradually. The army fought numerous wars during this time, and the commanders who survived defeats would change their tactics. The process undoubtedly took time, possibly decades, but it occurred. After a few months, Belisarius marched out of Carthage and faced Gelimer. Although Gelimer had gathered more men, he was still beaten that day. Seeking an ally, Gelimer sent envoys to Theodas, king of the Visigoths, but he decided to stay out of external conflicts. Belisarius then focused on gaining control of the entire Vandal kingdom, including Sardinia. Several months later, the Vandal army had been crushed, and Gelimer himself had surrendered in March 534. Belisarius returned to Constantinople with Gelimer to receive a hero's welcome. Well, Belisarius received a hero's welcome. Gelimer was in chains, so he received insults, thrown objects, and the prospect of a humiliating death. The Vandals did not survive the conquest of their kingdom. Aside from the losses during several battles, many were captured. As ever, young men were offered the option of serving on the Eastern Front, but the rest either embraced a new career as laborers or fled. The Vandals had kept themselves separate from their subjects, so they were not very numerous, and they basically disappeared as a socio-political unit. In fact, this refusal to mix with the general population was probably a factor in the defeat. Admittedly, the Vandals had not fought a major war in decades, but Gelimer was still defeated with surprising ease, which indicates that Belisarius was a good general with a very large, well-trained army. In particular, the horse archers would have been something entirely new for the Vandals. Good question. Would Belisarius have arranged an unfortunate accident for the inconvenient Hilderic if Gelimer had not promptly executed Hilderic when he learned of the imperial invasion fleet? The gamble had paid off with a huge return, so it should not be a surprise that Justinian decided to continue. The question is, who was his next target? Obviously, the Ostrogoths in Italy, especially since the kingdom was far from stable. Athalaric had died on October 2nd, 534, aged somewhere between 16 and 18, basically just when he could have ruled on his own. Amalasuentha responded by making her cousin Theodahad co-ruler. He did not remain co-ruler for long, since he had his own supporters, and Amalasuentha had arranged for the disappearance of too many rivals. She was arrested and apparently murdered in her own bathtub in April 535. Anyway, rumors of instability in Italy had reached Constantinople since Athalaric had died slowly. Actually, the execution of the Queen Regent was dangerously rash given Belisarius's conquest of Carthage and the capture of the Vandal king Gelimer a year earlier. Basically, Theodahad gave an expansionist emperor an excuse to invade. In the summer of 535, Belisarius was sent with a fleet to capture Sicily. Actually, he had a smaller army than he had led to North Africa because Justinian had not committed to a full invasion of Italy. Still, the various garrisons on Sicily surrendered surprisingly quickly, and he had gained complete control by the end of 535. Even though the Goths won a victory in Dalmatia a few months later, Belisarius had already received instructions from Justinian's envoy to invade Italy. Actually, the defeat in Dalmatia and the obvious challenge of conquering Italy should have made Justinian consider the merits of a more modest strategy, such as focusing on the reintegration of North Africa and Sicily into the Eastern Empire, but he decided to gamble once again. I need to stress that the reintegration of North Africa into the Eastern Empire was not a simple matter of changing the face on the coins. Gaiseric had conquered Carthage almost a century earlier. There was no one living in North Africa who would experience the empire firsthand. It would take years and a lot of work to transform the Vandal kingdom into a Roman province. Instead, Justinian wanted glory. In theory, the Roman landowners would have resented their barbarian overlords and flocked to Belisarius' army when it invaded, except there was little evidence that they did. The degree of loyalty to the Goth overlords is worth considering because Belisarius fought his way north from the south where he had crossed over from Sicily. Unsurprisingly, since the Goth army was based in the northeast around Ravenna, he did not encounter any resistance in the south, at least until he reached Naples, which had solid walls and a Goth garrison. If the local residents had refused to help defend the city or attempted to open the gates, the outnumbered garrison would have soon been overwhelmed. Instead, they fought to defend their city, so the siege dragged on. Actually, this was the true test of the Goth king. Belisarius' army was relatively small, and it was stuck outside of Naples. Theodahad could have sent an army to attack Belisarius, or at least make the siege unbearable. Instead, he attempted to negotiate some form of peace with Justinian. The failure to relieve Naples proved fatal. Left alone, Belisarius' engineers found a way into the city through an aqueduct, and troops were able to sneak in and open the gate. Recognizing that negotiations would fail, the Goth nobles executed Theodahad, and replaced him with Witiges, a solid military leader. Witiges realized that his situation was not secure, so he marched to Ravenna, seized the treasury, and married Theodoric's granddaughter Matasuentha without bothering with a courtship or her consent. Sadly, Witiges only had a moment to savor his sudden rise in status, since he faced trouble from multiple directions. One of those directions was northwest, basically the Frankish kingdom, which requires a bit of explanation. Burgundy had become an unwilling part of the Frankish kingdom, thus bringing the Franks close to Italy, so Witiges had to choose which expansion his neighbor was more dangerous. Concluding that the Eastern Empire was the main threat, Witiges gave Provence to Theodebert in 536. Actually, the Franks did not receive Provence for free. Childebert, Clothard, and Theodebert agreed to assist Witiges with troops in exchange for Provence. Basically, he received some assistance and did not have to waste troops in a doomed attempt to defend Provence against Frankish expansion. So, the Franks gained Provence, including the valuable ports of Marseille and Arles. Still, the Goth garrisons that had been in Provence returned to Italy, ensuring that Witiges outnumbered the invading imperial army. Meanwhile, Belisarius had occupied Rome, which must have looked good on a map in Constantinople, but he lacked the numbers to face Witiges' army, so most of 537 was spent in an exhausting Gothic siege of Rome. The year-long siege of Rome had been a stalemate until reinforcements led by Narses broke the siege in the summer of 538, but the two commanders disagreed over strategy. Belisarius wanted to avoid a direct battle, while Narses believed that victory would only happen after the Goth army had been defeated. Well, Belisarius was in charge, so he ordered Narses back to Constantinople in the spring of 539. Belisarius then slowly but steadily drove Witiges north, taking one fortified town at a time. It was a slow process, and Belisarius had only reached Ravenna by December 539. Once again, the horse archers were a new military technology, and the Goths could not adapt quickly to fast-moving elite troops with deadly accurate bows. Clinging to what was left of his kingdom, Witiges held out in Ravenna, but he offered formal submission to Justinian as long as he kept northern Italy. However, Justinian saw a reunited Roman Empire within his grasp and would not settle for anything less, while Belisarius would not be seduced with offers to make him Western Emperor. Worse, Witiges may have been safe in Ravenna, but he was losing support outside of the city. Belisarius was relentless, and many Goths were tired of war. Still, Justinian was worried about the Persian frontier, so he sent an offer to accept Goth rule of the northern half of Italy, but Belisarius refused to sign the treaty, believing that Witiges would soon surrender. Belisarius was proven right when Witiges surrendered in May 540. So, the empire had been reunited. It had not been cheap. Supplying an army in Italy was expensive, and much of Italy had been destroyed during several years of warfare. In particular, the ports Milan and Naples had been sacked. Even so, cities could be rebuilt, and Justinian could call himself Emperor of the Roman Empire, although it is a good question whether he planned to actually visit Rome. While Justinian had greatly expanded the empire in the west, the eastern border soon experienced a crisis. It is important to remember that Justinian had already started a massive rebuilding project in Constantinople to repair the damage caused by the Nika riots when he decided to invade North Africa. The project and the campaign against Sicily had been affordable, but the campaign in Italy lasted for years. The money to pay for years of war had to come from somewhere, so the defense budget for the Eastern Front probably suffered, although we do not have any precise figures. This would not have been a problem if Khusro was occupied with his own domestic issues or local revolts, but he wasn't. In fact, Justinian received a warning that Khusro was ready for a war when a Persian embassy arrived in Constantinople in 539. The embassy delivered the Shah's complaints that Constantinople was stirring up trouble in disputed territory. There was no official statement that Justinian should behave himself or there would be trouble, but The embassy explains why Justinian actually considered Witiges' reasonable offer to divide Italy between the Goths and the empire in order to transfer part of Belisarius' army to the Eastern Front. Anyway, Justinian made no effort to improve relations with the Shah. The Persians realized that a western expansion meant that the eastern borders were weak, but if they waited, Justinian would absorb that land and its tax revenue and then consider expanding east. So, a Persian army marched into Mesopotamia and sacked Antioch in June 540. Antioch had been replaced by Constantinople as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, but it remained the second city of the empire with a population of several 100,000 people. Its hippodrome could seat 80,000 people. The Christian community in Antioch was older than the Christian community in Rome, and the bishop of Antioch was one of the 5 patriarchs of the Christian faith. The center of the thriving provinces of Syria and Palestine, Antioch was protected by several fortresses guarding the border. However, Khusro decided to avoid the usual boring playbook of sieges. Confident that the weakened army in the east could not face him in battle, he simply marched by the fortresses and stormed the first city that he encountered. After its surviving citizens had been sold into slavery, rumors flew before him, and the next few cities simply paid massive ransoms. Obviously, a powerful city like Antioch could hold out for weeks, if not months. Not exactly. Antioch had not been threatened in decades, so its defenses had been allowed to decline. Khusro had a very large, very well-trained army, so the city fell during a massive attack. After a brief trip to swim in the Mediterranean, the Shah went home, taking a different route to extort ransoms from several more Roman cities. So, roughly a month after the fall of Ravenna, one of the greatest cities in the Eastern Roman Empire had been destroyed. The return on investment for the Shah's campaign was insane. 7,000 pounds of silver, 2,000 pounds of gold, and thousands of slaves of varying value, all acquired in the space of a few months. To sum up, Justinian gambled on an invasion of North Africa after the Nika riots. When the Vandal kingdom fell surprisingly quickly, Justinian captured Sicily as a base for the conquest of Italy. The Ostrogoths proved to be more difficult than the Vandals, so General Belisarius moved slowly, taking one city at a time. The war lasted for several years, but the Ostrogoth king finally surrendered. Great, Justinian could call himself Emperor of the Roman Empire. Except the newly reunited empire soon faced a crisis in the east. Since much of the imperial army was far away in Italy, the Shah of Persia sacked Antioch, one of the greatest cities in the empire. I will explain how Justinian dealt with that crisis and the continuing Ostrogoth resistance next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.